Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, the jankiest, goofiest NPC in your favorite role-playing game,
Trent Bergenrader. That's me.
Whoa, he's here again.
That's me.
He's here.
Yeah,
It's a he.
I'm happy to be here.
It's a he, Trent Bergenrader.
It's a me.
So today's conversation is going to center on role-playing games, although we're taking a slightly different approach than we did for our past episode on the World Building Workshop book chapter about roleplay. Rather than debating definitions or mapping roleplay techniques to the instructional framework we previously discussed, we're going to talk about the relationship between our favorite role-playing games and how they reveal their worlds through interaction. Trent was the one who came up with the idea for this episode, and I should specify before we get too far into it, we actually specifically decided not to include all role-playing games together. We're going to do digital role-playing games today. We'll probably follow up with another episode about tabletop and board role-playing games at some point. We just didn't want to glom them all together and pretend they're the same thing since they have different kinds of affordances. That said, Trent,
Yes.
Again, this was your idea. Tell us why you came up with this idea and what you hoped to get out of the conversation.
Yeah, well, this is like my origin story. I was just telling this to somebody the other day of how I got involved with games and learning, and it's because I was researching digital narrative and digital writing in the fields of professional writing, rhetoric and composition, and creative writing. And there wasn't a whole lot of anything in creative writing. And one of my advisors said, oh, well, you should look into games. That's probably the most interesting kinds of interactive digital writing. And from that point forward, it was sort of all over. But the first game that I bought for my play, because I'd only been playing Grand Theft Auto, which, and it's one of those things. I'm not too keen on the conversation about what is and what isn't a role-playing game, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, to a certain extent, you're taking on a role of a different character, and then, lots of games follow that. So we can maybe worry the definition of role-playing game a little bit. But the game that I started with was Fallout 3, and it is still one of my all-time absolute favorites. In Fallout, there's been a nuclear war, right? Everyone's living in these bunkers underground, these vaults underground, and you are growing up in the vault, and they take you through these different sort of stages. One of the things that I love about it is that you are born into the world. You start off as a baby coming out of the mother's womb, and the orientation and sort of like the tutorials of how to use the mechanics, where you are adolescent and you take your skill aptitude tests and all those kind of things, and then eventually you have to leave the vault, after not too long. But one of the things that I loved about it is, number one, I always loved tabletop role-playing games, big Dungeons and Dragons, played tons of different role-playing games when I was growing up. But the thing that I really loved about Fallout 3 was that I went outside, you get outside the vault, and there's like a clear road that is taking you, if you've played the game, it takes you down into town and then up into Megaton, which is this city built around a deactivated bomb. And I didn't go down that road because I wanted to be like, I'm going to go somewhere else, I'm going to explore whatever. And I died almost instantly because, you got your crappy 9mm gun or whatever. And I'm like, oh, this isn't that kind of game. Like, you can't just go walk. And it's like, the whole game is about how deadly the wasteland is, and I wasn't paying attention, right? So then I die, and I'd go back or whatever. And then I'm like, okay, well, now I'm going to squat and sort of walk around, and then creep around. And same thing happened. Like, I think it was a giant scorpion or something like that came up behind me and killed me. And I'm like, oh, maybe I should just do the thing of going down, the main path or whatever. And then you find a little bit better weapon and you're much better equipped. But it was really a strong moment for me in terms of understanding how role-playing games, digital role-playing games, teach you about the world that you're in, right? So if you're playing, and again, like, I wouldn't necessarily call Animal Crossing like a role-playing game, but in the same sense, but it's still in, it's a different genre, but it's like, okay, well, Animal Crossing is a much more gentle, cozy kind of game, right? And that world sort of unfolds for you in a very different way than is the violent, sort of brutal world and sort of black humor world of Fallout 3. This is one of the main reasons that I started using using tabletop role-playing games and role-playing games in general in creative writing, you just don't have your way. You have to think about the limitations and affordances that you have, and then, because in games we can die and start over again, then we can learn from that what to do and what not to do. And it's a very effective way, I think, of teaching people about what are the strategies for surviving in the case of Fallout, a terrible world or whatever. But then really all different kinds of games, it's all about how do you get your character in this environment to achieve whatever outcomes or goals they have. And you kind of go through the scientific process of trying things. And if it works, then that's great. There's a strategy you keep. And if you die or if you don't get what you want, then that was a failed strategy and you know not to do that anymore. Fallout 3, I played to 100% completion, which took, I don't know how many hundreds of hours. And I've dumped in lots and lots and lots of hours. Baldur's Gate 3, right? That was another one where it's like, man, the hours just kind of melt by because you're just so engrossed. And that game's a little bit different. It's not an open world exploration. Different areas open up. But still, it's that same sense of like all of these challenges that you face are always in a very specific situation, right? Like where it's like, sometimes you don't know who you can trust in a game and you don't know like what events are going to happen. And you just kind of got to, quote unquote, roll with it. And I think that that's something too for world building is that if a world is interesting and there are what I call in my classes productive questions, not like I don't understand why this isn't, why it works like this or whatever, but like, I wonder what's around that next bend or, I wonder why these people are out to kill me or, whatever it is, right? Those productive questions usually in these games have a big map that is more or less blank that you start exploring and then you start filling out the map and it's sort of like a cognitive mind map of what you know about the world, right? So you go ahead now, you tell me, Stephen, what are some, and we'll just kind of go from there. What are your favorite role-playing games and what is it that attracts you to them, do you think?
I have a list of more than 30 games I came up with because when you pitched this idea, I'm like, okay, great, I love that. I initially had suggested, too, that we do this with our favorite research, like the things that motivated us to go into the fields that we did. But I think this is even more targeted to the world building stuff. As I started to write out all these games, I'm like, what do they have in common? What are the patterns that are kind of emerging? And maybe it's the qualitative researcher in me that's looking for how I would code these kinds of things. But as I started to go through them, I'm like, every single one of these role-playing games taught me something really important about world building, game design, education, or the world itself. Not just the world in the game, but the world that we actually inhabit. And it's really funny. This coincidentally came right after we had this interview with Roger Travis about Plato's allegory of the cave and what constitutes good versus bad kinds of education, at least as far as Plato was concerned. And I started to think through, okay, if the common thread through all of these things is that they were teaching me stuff about the world or about their worlds, then are the games themselves not that good education? Are they not just a vehicle for doing the thing that Plato was talking about? And ironically, Roger mentioned that the cave shadows that are popping up on the wall were sort of the world's first video game. And that was, quote unquote, the bad education that the people in the cave were getting. And meanwhile, I'm thinking, well, the good education I got was from playing these games that all of my teachers would have said were a complete waste of time and energy because they were distractors from the, quote unquote, good education I was supposed to be getting in school. So my real education, the sort of Plato sending Socrates out of the cave education, came from playing these games that I was doing outside of school, whereas the sort of standard socioculturally ingrained or embedded kind of education I was getting in school didn't service me as well as some of these 30 plus games I put on this list.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I was thinking as we started pitching this idea to one another, what we could discuss about it. And to kind of drill down into the details, you had said you didn't really think that Animal Crossing might be in the same category as something like Fallout 3, and I tend to agree. I don't think those are the same thing, but as I tried to determine what would I do to differentiate some of these experiences from others, because I don't think Mario Kart is a role-playing game in any sense that a gamer would look at it and say you're role-playing as Toad driving a cart on the road, right? But one of the things that stands out is that you do project yourself into these spaces, into these worlds. They are telling you something about a specific place and time, and how you as the player interpret or perceive the affordances of these games matters a lot. And with respect to the situated cognition, you had said filling in the map, right? You're going out into the world, you're filling in the map with all of these regions you're going to, people you meet, ideas you're coming across. that to me is what makes something a role play, that you
Right.
find a way to connect your own identity to the identities being expressed by the character you're playing as. And
Right.
Roger actually has this whole other area of his research in classics where he talks about the story of Odysseus being portrayed to the peoples in the book, the Odyssey, and he's being played like an Xbox. So
Hmm.
he is putting in the disc to describe what happened with the Cyclops or what happened with the Lotus Eaters. And he is then just being played by the king he's telling this story to, as if
Yeah.
he has a controller in his hand and is toggling the buttons to get Odysseus to say the thing he wants him to say next.
Yeah.
And I think that's a big part of how I think about role playing games across the board. Like, I, as the player, am in this bi directional relationship with the game that I'm playing, and the story doesn't exist. We actually talked about this a little bit with Roger, too. The story doesn't exist without me, the player, grabbing that controller and participating in the telling of that story, which does
Yeah.
make it different than, say, a textbook or a movie or a static object that you are watching, listening to, whatever. Games only exist temporally. You have to be doing a thing as the participant, which means you are inherently putting yourself into this
Into that
world.
role. Yeah.
And so when you're talking about going into the world of the wasteland, not only is there a really interesting parallel there with the allegory of the cave and the fact
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
people are
Yeah.
in the vaults and
Exactly.
they're coming
Yeah.
out
Yeah.
into the sunlight, right? I think that's kind of just interesting as a coincidence. But when you're going out into the world of the wasteland and you come across that first supermarket where there are bandits inside,
Yeah.
or you're going out to because it's Fallout 3, you're going through Washington, D.C., and you find the Declaration of Independence, but it's being guarded by super mutants or whatever. That is you, Trent, the person,
Yeah.
projecting your beliefs, your personality, your attitude onto the character who's doing that, interacting with the world. And the lens through which that character is going to behave is inherently shaped by your situativity, your
Yeah.
environmental context. And this is one of the things I love about role plays in general, is that it allows you to try on different kinds of attitudes and belief structures. So when I'm playing Fallout, I might be a chaos agent who's going out into the world and murdering everyone, murder hobo mode, or
Right.
I could instead approach this as somebody who wants to try on being an extremely ethical person, kind of like Lucy in the Fallout TV show. She's trying to project her values from being within the vault onto the wasteland and say, this can be a nicer, better place, in spite of the fact that the world around her is constantly trying to kill her.
Right.
And all of this kind of adds up as being this inquiry driven experience, to bring it back to education, where I am the learner in this world. I don't know the things that are happening around me. And I don't just mean in the context of Fallout, but in Chrono Trigger or World of Warcraft or Fable, or insert your favorite role play here.
Yeah.
I am the person who's going to have to learn about this world, act on that world, figure out how I'm changing it to match my image of what the world should be, and also learning what the author wants me to understand about the world that they've created. So
Yeah.
if you look at something like Disco Elysium, it has a very specific kind of socio-political commentary baked into that story, but that story only gets told if I engage with that world and either press on the attitudes that are being expressed or align myself with them. And then I
Right.
get to see how the author would respond to those specific kinds of situations, which makes all of these things, and maybe this is where I would circle on what makes a role play a role play. I am engaging with the world and then co-telling this story that has a branching series of arcs coming out of whatever decisions I make, like you were describing with Baldur's Gate 3. What makes that a great experience is that I can project lots of different kinds of versions of myself into that world, and through trial and error figure out, how do these behaviors map to those of the people around me? How do my beliefs map to those of the people around me? And what does it mean for me as a consequence of those beliefs or behaviors to engage in this way? What am I learning about myself through this process?
Right.
So I see a lot there.
It doesn't even have to always be, I mean, this is where obviously on the educational side, we want them to be used and deployed in a very specific way, and metacognition, thinking about what you're doing. But this is where too, like I think a lot, I'll talk about Grand Theft Auto in just a second, but in the, in Mario Kart rather, it's like, okay, so I had some friends in college, we would play Mario Kart or whatever it was back then or whatever, right? And one of the jokes was, if you were Wario or whatever, and you ran somebody over when they were miniaturized, then you would laugh like Wario, right? Or you'd say, it's a me, or, and it's like, oh, are you playing more aggressively because you are Bowser, right? Or, whatever. And it's like, well, to a certain extent, are you role playing that, right? Like, I'm going to run everybody over because I'm the evil Bowser or whatever, or it's so those kind of questions. But that's where one of the things that I was really interested in, and I've always thought about studying this or seeing if anybody else has written on it, is if you're playing Nico Bellic, I think is the name of the Grand Theft Auto 4 character, right? Point being is that you do have options in which you can execute somebody or you could let them go, whatever. And I always wonder, like, what kind of Nico am I playing? And am I
Hmm.
playing what I would do? Like, I obviously wouldn't murder somebody. I would let them go. But I'm not playing as me. I'm playing as Nico, or I'm playing as Spider-Man, or I'm playing as whoever. And there's this
Hmm.
question of, well, what can you do? What can't you do? Are you role playing as yourself? Are you role playing what you think the character would do? Like, are you inhabiting those shoes, right? So, and it's a little bit different when you're given the scenario in Grand Theft Auto in a way that it's much more of an open book when you start out Fallout 3, but you've still got to do what the game is pushing you to do. You can't spend all your time, right? So, at some point, you can do anything you want except for all the things that you can't do. That's one of the things that people always say. I love Skyrim because I can do anything I want. It's like, well, can you pick up a random table? Well, no, you can't, right? I mean, it's like,
Hmm.
like there might be something. So there are always those constraints. And even though you can do a whole lot that maybe doesn't have any point, you still can't do everything, which is one of the reasons why I like tabletop games so much, because you kind of can literally do
Hmm.
whatever you house rule around the table. Whereas, in Grand Theft Auto 4, you can choose not to execute somebody and then get in your car and drive on the sidewalk and run over 30 pedestrians, right? And this is where, the term is ludonarrative dissonance, where the gameplay and the narrative don't necessarily need to be in sync, right? Like, you can choose things that are ridiculous for your character to choose to do, and that's just part of the game. But I would imagine that most people try, I mean, again, this is my supposition, try to play a coherent identity for
Hmm.
your character. And if you want to try on a new identity, then you build a new character and try, and
Yeah.
it's more than just like, oh, I'm a sniper versus a brawler or whatever, right? It's more like, oh, I'm going to do the pro-social or the anti-social, or I'm going to be a jerk this time. It's like,
Hmm.
and that's where, with Fallout 2, they had the morality system in which you did things and you either got good karma or bad karma for it. So then there's also a visual cue of whether you're behaving in a pro-social or anti-social way. So it's one of those things that are like the Halo series, right? It's another thing too, in which, yeah, you're Master Chief and everybody who plays it is Master Chief, but maybe you play it a little differently, right? Maybe you're only
Hmm.
grenades, or maybe, whatever it is. Or like if you're going to play a board game like Risk, like if everyone dresses up in different general outfits, and then has to talk with the accent of whatever country they think that they're representing or whatever, right? I mean, that's like, oh, well, you could bring a role play to just about anything, right? So that's where, for me at least, it gets a little slippery in terms of a role playing game is maybe one that is more intentional about it, but you can role play anything at any time, right? I can role play being a dad, and then role play being a son, and then role play being a husband, and then role play being a professor, which is what we do all the time in our given lives, right? We're always wearing many hats and playing many different roles. But in games, that allows you to experiment in a low stakes or no stakes kind of environment, and
Hmm.
try different things and then see how the world reacts. And this is where, not to keep rambling on, I'll let you get back in a second here, but this is where, when you think about concepts like procedural rhetoric, I don't know if Ian Bogost coined the phrase or whether he was just the one who popularized it. I think he coined it. But anyway, just the idea that, games are making statements about the world that you're playing in based
Hmm.
on what you can and what you can't do, right? So then it's like, oh, well, if I go outside and shoot a random stranger or drive on the sidewalk, there will be severe consequences for me, right? Like I
Hmm.
cannot do that. But in a game, yeah, you get a couple stars in Grand Theft Auto, and then cops don't eventually you outrun them or whatever, and go back to not having the cops after you, or it goes up to 5 stars and eventually they kill you, right? And it's like, oh, well, that's
Hmm.
not really an accurate portrayal of the world, but it's also not trying to be, right? So it's one of those things where you're learning how the rules of Grand Theft Auto work rather than the rules of our world.
That's one of the reasons why I used to emphasize to both my teacher education students as well as my game design students that they functionally had the same job as one another.
Mm-hmm.
But the teachers were just cultivating a classroom environment that was constrained in ways that were hopefully going to guide someone to understanding the learning objectives associated with the content. A game designer does the same exact thing. They're constraining an environment to situate you in a particular idea or set of ideas or behaviors and get you to actualize those things. But that's always coming up against, and I think this is true in a classroom as much as it is a game, it's always coming up against what the designed intent was versus you creating your own emergent narrative that accompanies all of this. So, like you
Yeah.
said, I can drive around and be a lunatic in Grand Theft Auto. I could also be a lunatic in a classroom and throw stuff around and
Yeah.
cause trouble, right? Or
Right.
be the class clown or take on these other identities that might make me perceived differently by other people in the space. It's just that the game designer in some ways has an easier job because for them, they get strict control over what affordances in that environment exist. That the player, like you said, can't just go pick up a table in Skyrim unless that's designed into the game.
Right.
But they also need to be able to communicate the relevant ideas without being there to facilitate directly.
Right,
It has to
right.
be indirect, which makes it a little bit more complicated. And so I'm going to go back to Mario Kart for a second. My friends and I used Mario Kart to simulate playing a cross-country road trip. So when I was a little kid, this is one of the things that we would do is we'd sit in my friend's room. He had a Super Nintendo. We'd play F-Zero or Mario Kart and turn on the time trials. And then we would role play characters and use the game as a way to communicate to one another. We're now traveling down the road. And when we get to the end of the time trial, we're going to pull over and now we're going to role play outside of the game. And then we're going to go back to the game when it's time to get back on the road again. That's a kind of role play, but that's not being constrained by the game environment. The game environment is being extended by us as the players. And then we're projecting ourselves into these characters that can transcend from the real lived experience of being ourselves into the game experience of being the driver in the F-Zero car or in the Mario Kart car. I think that's probably the part as I grew up that I noticed the most about different kinds of games, that I could project myself in different ways and then take those ideas back out and apply them in the real world in specific ways. And this is kind of what differentiated me as an educator from my peers, because I didn't see very many other people beyond Roger, actually, in my educational experience going through K-12 and then higher ed, where a professor or a teacher was looking for those points of connection between popular media like video games and what we were learning in the classroom. They tried to separate those two things and pretend that video games aren't real life. You need to go learn real life skills by taking this history class or this chemistry class. Video games can't teach you anything useful because they're just there for fun. And this is one of the reasons why, drawing back on that gamefulness, playfulness, fun chapter that we discussed a long time ago, it never made sense to me to disaggregate those things because they're not mutually exclusive. The people who are designing the games have opinions and authorial intent, and there's a reason why they're designing things the way that they are. And in my list of games here, I included Final Fantasy VII as the first quote unquote real RPG I think I played, at least in terms of adult themes and stuff. That game, in addition to teaching me the story of the game and those specific characters, taught me that games could be about something important. And when I say about, I'm using like the air quotes here, it's about a political, socio-political system. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with the gist of Final Fantasy VII, you start by being a mercenary who works with an eco-terrorist group to take down a giant corporation that is completely polluting and destroying the planet. That's not just about the world of Final Fantasy VII. That's about capitalism, and it's about authoritarianism. And you have to kind of think through, at least if you're a thoughtful player, where does this map to my lived reality in the quote unquote real world? And what do I take from the real world that I bring back into that game in terms of my behavior? Now, the technical limitations of games like that through the 80s, the 90s, the early 2000s, I think were one of the reasons why you didn't see a lot of the choose your own adventure style outcomes, just because you couldn't build a game that had enough content in those ways that would represent something akin to a tabletop game. But now we have Baldur's Gate 3, and the technical limitations for all intents and purposes have been sort of eliminated. You could build basically anything you want. And that ability to build anything you want now means that the line blurs more and more between what do I see as being a quote unquote tabletop roleplay experience versus a video game roleplay experience. And I had also included Valheim in here as one of the examples where if you've played games like Minecraft or Terraria, you do a lot of this survival plus building stuff. It's
resources, gather resources.
Well, we played Valheim together with some of our other friends in the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And that became a role play experience where it wasn't just about the Vikings that are building their little settlement. It also was about us as people and the kinds of characters we wanted to portray or the attitudes we wanted to project while we were playing. And so that emergent gameplay experience does something a little bit different than those earlier games that I was talking about, like Final Fantasy VI, Final Fantasy VII, Chrono Trigger, etc. It takes those same ideas and then pulls them into this liminal space between reality and virtual reality and allows you to sort of try on these ideas in ways that are, as you noted, fail safe, or that you can fail safely in them. And you can decide what kind of person do I really want to be in my day-to-day lived experience, not just in the game, but when I'm meeting other people or performing these roles that are expected of me, which I think is a really unique affordance of games in general. But especially when you have authorially designed games that are communicating a specific kind of experience, you can do a lot with this sort of thing to play around with, pun not intended, but you can play around with different kinds of attitudes, behaviors, beliefs, etc., in ways that you really couldn't before this technology existed, at least not in the ways that you now can have the designed experience that some game developer decides they want you to have.
Yeah, and that's, the thing too is that this is where reader response theory, does the text have any meaning, or does the reader create the meaning? So in a class of 30 students or whatever, and you all read Lord of the Rings or you all read The Great Gatsby or whatever, the book is functionally the same, but different readers have different interpretations and they pull different things out, but they're all reading the same exact book. They're all working with the same text. Or if we watched Mandalorian and Grogu, we've watched the same movie. Doesn't matter if it's different parts of the country, right? It's the same film, same number of minutes. Whereas if we talk about Fallout 3 or Baldur's Gate 3 or any of these games, right? It's like, oh, well, what did you do, right? And it's like, well, I didn't choose to do those things. I did completely different things. Or this mission that you did third, I did 33rd, right? It came way later. I was playing somebody who was going to be antisocial, like a bad guy. It's like, oh, I was playing somebody who was... So you have a very different kind of experience. And it's one of those things I think non-gamers don't get it. Like, why would you watch other people? This is the thing with my kids, too. Like, why are you watching other people play games? And it's because it's like, well, why would you read a book that somebody else wrote, right? It's kind of the same thing where it's like, well, I want to see what choices they're making. I want to see what they come up with. And it's a lot harder to tell, I had an awesome game of Centipede or Space Invaders or whatever, right? And it's like, well, but we've talked about different things that we've run into in, these Fallout 4 or whatever. I was thinking about when you can equip, we were talking with Roger about this years and years and years ago, that you can equip your NPC companion with a weapon. And he gave her one of the Nuka launchers and they came across a roach and she decided to use the nuclear thing, and that makes us all laugh because you can understand exactly what is going on there, and try and tell that to somebody who's never played a video game before, right? It's like, oh, I gave a nuclear device and they blew us up to kill a roach, and it'd just be like blank, you know what I mean? And it's not about winning or strategies to get ahead. It's about describing the experience that you've had, right? And then how did that make you feel? And what did you get from it? Because that's also where in these moments there's like Fallout New Vegas. I keep going to the Fallout series because I love it. But there's one in Fallout New Vegas. There's a mission that you take on in which there's been somebody who has deliberately been tampering with the radios because he doesn't want these people to be needlessly deployed, right? And it's like, well, that's illegal and I've been doing it, and it's like, wow, this is actually kind of an interesting moral question that I've stumbled across here for all of the absurdity of Fallout and the black humor. It was like an actual moment of like, man, that's kind of a, an emotional, kind of sentimental feeling. And that happens quite a bit in these games. And then you have to think about, well, what, if you're playing it not just like I'm going to blow everybody's head off, but if you take it like, oh, what do I do? And then it's this question of like, am I doing what Trent would do? Am I doing mechanically? You can do whatever you want, right? I mean, there's nothing that you've done in the past that is going to stop you from, it would just be incoherent in your mind. Why is the character that I'm playing suddenly going to do this thing that they hadn't ever done, act completely out of character? And again, it's one of those things.
Sorry, I was just going to say, there's a really interesting example here where, going back to something you had said to Roger, I keep thinking about this metaphor you pitched to him about holding the bell, the cowbell, and then holding it around the edges versus holding it at the end and then hitting it with something and seeing how well does it resonate, right? This reminds me of when they did the Twitch Plays Pokemon thing and everybody typed in or voted on what should happen next, or basically the way that it worked is Pokemon is being played. There are many different viewers who are participating in this experience. And then the game is being played based on the most recent thing that was pitched in the chat, or people voted on what should happen next. And that is sort of a community experience, I think, has more resonance than if you just let Pokemon automatically get played by an AI, right? You can imagine any one of these games we're discussing being quote unquote played by a computer, and it's just going to do the most efficient thing possible, but that's going to have almost no valenced emotion at all or it's not going to have any resonance at all because there's no human decision making as part of this. Whereas if you're playing Fallout and you choose to equip your companion with a nuke and then the companion does something like blow you both up trying to kill a roach, there's an emotional experience built in there that has much greater resonance. And it's the main reason why I used to say to people, if you're building a curriculum, your job is actually to be kind of like a movie theater where you bring a bunch of different people in who have different background experiences, and you use the movie as a focusing lens to get them to all attend to one specific idea. So even if they all came in from different walks of life, they're leaving with a shared experience that they're then going to be able to go out into the world and act on. Games kind of do the inverse. Their job is to present you with a series of choices, and those choices, the psycho-emotional valencing of those choices, is what makes that experience worthwhile, because it communicates something about you as the player and the way you understand reality. I'm going to keep going back to this idea of bidirectional storytelling, but you, in companionship with the author of the game, are deciding what do we say or feel about a given thing. It's sort of like the difference between having been the person in the trolley doing the trolley problem versus just watching the trolley go off the tracks and kill people, right? You have ownership of this. You have some stake in what's happening here. And that stake is the thing that gives all of these experiences meaning. And they're all communicating something interesting and different about the world in terms of theme, in terms of purpose, in terms of what it is to be a person in reality. That I think that's the piece that often gets missed by people who think, well, video games aren't real life, or video games don't quote unquote count as learning. It's like, no, that's the point of art. Like, the whole reason we're here is not just because you created a painting and no one's going to look at it. Is you create a painting because you want somebody to feel something and understand something more about themselves. And that's what role play does. It allows you to express something about yourself in this way that may not be experienced by any other player, probably can't be, because it's all situated. So it's like the ultimate situated experience for me.
And that's, the other thing too that the other games that I've been playing quite a bit recently, although I had to take a break because of my stupid job, but playing Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077 that are both made by CD Projekt Red. And it took me 3 times to really get into The Witcher 3. And the first time I'm like, okay, I don't really know what I'm doing here and blah, blah, blah. And like, I just didn't find the hook never set. The second time I got a little bit further, took a break or whatever, because it's like, oh, I can kind of see the appeal, whatever. But then I watched the TV show, and then I got interested in the transmedia aspect of it. So then I read all the books, right? And then when I went back to play The Witcher, like all of a sudden that knowledge of the world made all the difference in the world. Like, I understand Geralt as a character. I understand the world of The Witcher 3. And it's like, oh, well, it's not just like any war-torn, environment. It's like, it's this specific place and time that is situated, and then it's like, oh, and I don't get to choose. I can outfit and equip Geralt however I want, and I can choose, is he going to help somebody or is he not going to help somebody, and it's like, oh, if somebody makes you mad, do you just turn your back or do you kill him or whatever it is, right? But it's not just me deciding everything. And it's like, okay, well, I do have a role in this story, right? And it's weird because there are things that are very similar to some events of the books and the short stories and things like that. And then there's other things that are just pure additions, right? Like pure extensions of, most of the game is a pure extension. But and again, it's one of those things that most players, I imagine, who aren't academics aren't really thinking about it. But it's a really good sort of question. Or a game like Cyberpunk 2077 in which you play as V, but there is no V that anybody knows, right? Like Geralt, you watch the movie or watch the TV shows, rather, read the books, you know who that character is. V is whoever you want it to be, right? And it still can't be completely open. There are some limitations, and there's always, like we talked about, there's always the limitations that the designers are offering you. But it's the same thing. Like I really started getting into Cyberpunk 2077, I was familiar with, but not super familiar with the Cyberpunk tabletop role-playing game. And all of these things start feeding into each other, right? Where it's like, I loved watching Edge Runners, I think is what, Netflix series on Cyberpunk 2077. I've read some of the comic books, right? And it's like, oh, well, that came, normally you're finding your way back to a role-playing game through media, right? Like you're a Star Wars fan or whatever. You will then pick up the role-playing game later because that's another way to experience it. And in these games, it's a little bit different, in which they actually, for me, created entry points into these fictional worlds, right? And it's like, okay, well, now I want to experiment. We're both huge Star Wars fans, right? And this is what cosplayers have been doing forever. And then Disney has been doing this now with Galaxy's Edge and sort of encouraging cosplay and encouraging people to wear not masks, but, dressing up or whatever. And I think it's all sort of scratching the same human itch to be able to try on different personalities, try on different kinds of attitudes and whatever. And then the thing that is nice about digital role-playing games, even though that they're not completely unconstrained and you're going to be working within the limitations, is that you don't need anybody else to play, right? And this is my major frustration as an adult, trying to find people, coordinate schedules to get a tabletop role-playing game together. Well, if I fire up Cyberpunk 2077 on my PC, it's just me and the machine. You know what I mean? Like, I don't need I don't need anybody else. Or like MMOs, which I've not ever been a huge fan of MMOs, but then it's like, oh, well, people talk to each other using their screen names or their account names, and it's like a party develops. Obviously they each have their own archetype in which they're going to provide some sort of role for the party, whether they're the distance attacker or the brute or the healer or whatever it is. But then you also, over extended periods of time, start to develop sort of personalities for what your characters, and the team dynamics and things like that. It's all of these things I think are really sort of interesting because they are so popular with so many different people, and so many different people choose to play different types of games and inhabit them in different ways, right? So it's like there's something very deep and profound going on in terms of what is it that makes us attracted to these types of games, right? It's like playing, I'm a huge soccer fan, so I play a ton of FIFA, and I make a character who looks just like me, right? And I'll move from different teams, and have a story of a season and all that kind of stuff too. And to an extent, that is another kind of role play. You know what I mean? In which it's like, oh, I'm pretending that I'm the professional athlete that I was never good enough to be, right? And I'm not pretending that I am Leo Messi. I get to pretend that I'm Trent Hergenrader, who happened to be successful and rich, unlike the path that I've actually gone on. I was
going to say the younger, better looking, wealthier.
Yeah. Exactly.
It's funny. I want to go back to MMOs for a second, because one of the biggest differences I felt in transitioning from one game to another was I was a longtime player of World of Warcraft. I was heavily invested in the world of Azeroth and its characters and the way that that world had kind of developed over the course of the real-time strategy games into the MMO, where now you're taking this world that previously you were just kind of playing God with the melee and distance attackers and whatever, trying to set up sort of a strategy, and then becoming one of those little minions that's in those games, right? And thinking about how would I, as a person inhabiting this world, interpret the events that are unfolding around me? Because previously, all the major characters, well, they're just part of the campaign and you're playing as them, but all of them all at once. And that's quite a different experience than being sort of personally dropped into the world and having to decide which side of this conflict am I actually going to be on, especially because in Warcraft, the two sides were the Alliance and the Horde, which sort of were originally the good guys and the bad guys. Yeah. Do I want to be one of the good guys, or do I want to be one of the bad guys? It's a little more complicated than that now, and they've sort of merged them, and there's ways you can play cross-faction or whatever. That was dramatically different than my experience playing Star Wars: The Old Republic, which was the Star Wars MMO that allowed you to take on a class in addition to being part of either the sort of rebels versus the Empire, right? But those classes, because the game was organized as a choose your own adventure, in addition to being an MMO, meant that you could play as a kind of character who had different ethical or moral belief structures than the other people who were still on your side, which meant I really loved playing the character I ended up developing, which was an Imperial agent who did not believe in the Sith or did not believe in the Force, but was heavily committed to the socio-political organization of the Empire. So you have this person who has no religious orientation at all in this universe, but is committed to the structures of the Empire. I think this is actually probably pretty similar to Cyril Karn from Andor, now that I think about it. But to then be in that universe where the story is unfolding around me, I know, because Star Wars is a huge transmedia experience, what the Empire is up to, what the Rebels are up to, or what the Republic is up to. I get the gist of the way that the galaxy is organized. Well, now I get to decide for myself, what does it feel like to be this kind of person embedded in this kind of environment, running up against these belief structures, even if we're ostensibly on the same side.
Right.
And that was a much richer experience than I had ever had playing World of Warcraft, which had this robust community. Like, there were people I played with and I cared about, and I had sort of parasocial relationships with some of the characters in that universe. That was categorically different than being able to, or at least identifying affordances of that specific MMO that allowed me in Star Wars: The Old Republic to now decide for myself, what kind of person do I want to be in Star Wars? And as the game progresses and you move along the story or the narrative as it was designed, and you get to level up and you get these new abilities, you're seeing the contours of a character take shape that I now am more heavily invested in, because those decisions aren't just things that happened in the world. They're decisions I made in that world. And that differentiated itself from World of Warcraft, where even though I'm playing with a guild of people who are real humans and we're all watching the same story unfold together, it's not quite the same as me
Right.
feeling as though my character was revealing something about me personally. Whereas in the Old Republic, that is very much what was happening. Is I had embodied, for lack of a better word, this Imperial agent who constantly found himself being more and more at odds with the side he had chosen at the beginning of my play experience.
Hmm.
And that comes out in really interesting ways once
Yeah.
you get to the end game, because now you're seeing the Dark Lord of the Sith and deciding, do I really want to be a part of this anymore?
Yeah.
If I found
Right.
myself pushed out of the thing that I thought I was going to be a part of, all of that is emergent narrative that comes from my specific situated experience in that world that had been created. And this is something that the developers of Baldur's Gate 3, Larian Studios, had to think really carefully about. Are we okay with the fact that 0.1% of the player population will ever see this particular narrative
Right.
outcome? But I think as a designer, I am in favor of that approach where I would rather design a robust environment where players can learn something about themselves through the gameplay than try to force them into a specific outcome. And this is actually a great segue into one of the things that got me booed at a conference once. My unpopular opinion, we were at the Games Learning and Society conference and we had a panel discussion. It was, I think you were on it actually. It was me, you, Roger, Constance Steinkuhler, Kurt Squire. There were a bunch of people who did game scholarship. And I remember at one point we got into this conversation about narrative. And I told everyone in the room, there were about 50 people in the audience, one of my least favorite narrative experiences was playing The Last of Us.
Mm.
And it got me booed because I said I hated the way that that game ended. And everyone was like, but the narrative, it's so good. It did this twist. And I said, but the problem was the way that Naughty Dog designed that ending. And I get why they did what they did. The way they designed it, I had no agency. So over the
Yeah.
course of this entire game, I am developing as the character Joel. I am projecting myself into Joel's shoes and thinking, how do I think about this world that I now inhabit, or the world that I've gotten to learn about through his eyes? And then at the very end of that game, I'm going to spoil the end of that game. So if you haven't played The Last of
only
Us or
20
know
years
how it
old,
ends at this
yeah.
point, yeah, I know, right? If you haven't watched the TV show, too bad. Joel kills the doctors that are about to operate on Ellie. Then he kills the leader of the Fireflies, takes Ellie out of the hospital, and lies to her about what ended up happening through that series of events. I was furious when I played through that because I didn't want to do that as the player. And it created that
Yeah.
dissonance where the character I have been playing and projecting myself into is now making a decision that I disagree with and had not been playing toward,
Right.
especially because he kills innocent people. Like the doctors didn't have weapons. There was nothing they were doing wrong in that moment. And Joel just kills them out of rage and care for Ellie. That sort of caused me to bounce off of the game and think this was actually kind of a shitty role play experience because
Yeah.
I didn't actually ever do anything that mattered. It was all just a rail system that I had been placed on by the designers. And so going back to that question of authorial intent versus player agency, my agency was ripped away from me
Yeah.
and all
Yeah.
the learning I'd done about that world didn't matter. And so
Yeah.
that's what makes me gravitate toward these situations that are less linear or well defined and makes me admire more what Larian did with Baldur's Gate 3 because they really did say you get to decide what kind of person you're going to be and we will create that sandbox in which you can play and try on all these different attitudes. I think Fallout is kind of in the same vein. You mentioned
Yeah.
Megaton at the beginning of this episode. You have the option to detonate the bomb at the center of Megaton or save Megaton, right?
Yep.
You have these sort of emotionally and ethically valenced options available to you. Those kinds of role plays are incredibly important, at least as educative experiences, because you want to give the player agency to decide for themselves who am I going to be and why am I going to be that way. You don't want to force them necessarily onto this linear path where at the end of it, it's like, well, we know that you thought Joel went through all this character development, but we're ripping that away from you and telling
Yeah.
you, too bad, he's actually just an asshole.
Yeah, that's, at the end of Fallout 3, they did the same thing in which you are sacrificing yourself. Again, 20-year-old game, no spoilers or whatever. But it winds up that you need to go into this highly radiated area in order to, plug the water purifier in and basically save the world. And I remember when because I didn't play Fallout 3 until it had been out for a number of years. So, all the people had discussed it or whatever. But yeah, like on Reddit, people would get really, really mad that it's like, well, number one, there's a mutant there who is immune, right? So why didn't he just go do it? I didn't need to. And like, oh, but now this whole game has been, about me making all of these choices. And then at the very end, you're going to take that away. And the only way to get to the only ending is to sacrifice yourself, right? And it's that same kind of thing where I think, in other games, they kind of have that the game needs to stop somewhere, even though that's kind of debatable. I don't know how many times I've played a tabletop role-playing game in which there's been an actual conclusion, right? That it hasn't just fallen apart. And I mean, out of all of the games, like if we listed all of the games that we've played, all the tabletop role-playing games that we've played, digital or whatever, but I'm like, oh, I've finished all of the Fallout ones every time. But I mean, like Skyrim, I just kind of stopped playing after a while. You know what I mean? I dump in hundreds and hundreds of hours, or Oblivion, I never even got close. That's the game right before Elder Scrolls 4. Like I just stopped playing because I got sidetracked or I didn't, whatever. And it's like, how many, I mean, of course you start books and you don't finish them, if you don't like them or whatever, you don't watch an entire movie. But it seems really common, especially in the genre of the role-playing game, that you don't always even finish it. Like you get what you get out of it, and that is in of itself enough, right? Like just seeing whatever, you're getting to the final thing, and it's like, it's not even about saving the world or finding out what happened to your dad or, whatever it is. It's just that whole experience of being able to say, I made these choices and I had these consequences and I liked it or I didn't, you know what I mean, or whatever it was, or it gave me these feels or these emotions or whatever, which I think is really cool as opposed to Donkey Kong or whatever, where it's like, oh, you don't really have, you're just kind of going from one side of the screen to the other, from bottom to the top, and then it's just kind of over once you finish the last challenge. And, that's where you can keep going around, even if you finished all of the quests and whatever, you can still go around and explore the world and have random encounters. It's not nearly as much fun. But yeah, I mean, I think that's something that is really unique about about role-playing games as well. And that's where both The Witcher 3 and Cyberpunk 2077, I know both have endpoints, right? In which too, and it's like I want to make sure that I'm not getting too carried away and I don't accidentally, start a quest that's going to take me down the end chapter. They're all quite different than other genres of games. And again, that's where, the fun part with tabletop role-playing games is you can just kind of agree, we're going to stop now. You know what I mean? Or someone gets sick and they got to go to the hospital and then your Tuesday night falls apart and you never see each other and everyone moves to different parts of the country and that game just kind of ends. And it's like, oh, I wonder if we could resurrect those characters, or wonder where they would be now.
Yeah, I think what you're describing, at least as it's coming across to me, is the difference between having unlimited exploration and experimentation versus the coming up against the walls. And maybe this is the thing that would differentiate a role-playing game versus a non-role-playing game, is how quickly do you hit that wall of experimentation. So it's kind of like the Truman Show, honestly, where you're in the world of Truman, and at the end of that movie, here's another spoiler for something decades old, but Jim Carrey's character finds out he's been in a TV show this entire time and the whole world around him is sort of manufactured, and eventually he comes up to the wall and he kind of steps out. Again, getting back to our Plato's allegory of the cave, right? The real versus fake education. But that's kind of what role play does, is it allows you to experiment up to the boundaries of whatever that game's systems are. And I know for myself, I can't speak for everybody else, but I think that's when I finally hit that threshold of, all right, I think I'm done. I found everything that is meaningfully different about what my options are able to give me out of this experience. And I hit the wall and I go, all right, well, I'm done. But that's categorically different than playing with other people or trying to play in an environment that's constantly evolving, because as I think you've mentioned a few times over several episodes, you're always wondering, like, okay, so then what happened the day after? And you can kind of keep that going infinitely, which is why I think so many tabletop role-playing games never reach that point. There is no defined endpoint. The endpoint is when you decide it's going to be, whereas with a video game, there's a final quest, and there has to be a final quest because there needs to be a conclusion to the thing, unless it's an MMO that can just keep getting funded forever. But ultimately, you're going to find some kind of ending to that story that began whenever you turned on the console and picked up a controller. And I think this is one of the reasons people got so pissed off about the end of Mass Effect 2. Not Mass Effect 2, Mass Effect also.
Also, yeah.
The Mass Effect game series, when that ended after the third game, people were furious because the differences, I'm using like scare quotes here, the differences between the endings were so marginal, and it felt like, oh, I made all of these really interesting, difficult choices, but nothing mattered. It was all
Yeah.
on a rail system anyway. And again, I think this is one of the challenges that maybe Larian did a better job of this than anyone else because they had so much available to them in terms of technical and other resources. But it's just really hard to tell a story when every choice you make branches you into a new reality.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, if you want the choices to be meaningful, then you need to make sure that you're creating many different conclusions that accommodate all of those different choices.
Right.
It's one of the reasons why I think the Telltale games, like I loved them when I initially played them, the Telltale Walking Dead games, like they were really enjoyable for me until I went back and played them a second time and realized my choices didn't actually matter because the branching narrative always had to loop back to the main quest line. And yeah, maybe it felt good or bad to make a choice in that moment. But as soon as I knew that the choice, like it didn't actually make a difference for where my outcome was going to be, the games lost their flavor. They lost their whatever it was, the spark that made them enjoyable in the first place. That's one of those reasons why that I think the emergent narratives that come from us deciding how we want to play a game, that going back to Grand Theft Auto, I can make up my own games using the sandbox that's made available to me. I will find the affordances of that Truman Show set that I'm trapped on, and I can tell as many stories as I want. I can project myself into those stories in any ways that I want, but ultimately I'm going to run into the edges of that wall and I'm going to say, well, I've done everything I could, or I don't think there's much more I can garner from going through this experience multiple times. Whereas one of the things that really appealed to me about the From Software games, Demon Souls, Dark Souls, Bloodborne, Elden Ring, is that the lore or the worlds that are presented in those games, they are sort of intentionally opaque, and you are participating in a world that existed long before your character got there and will exist long after your character disappears from that environment. Even if the narrative of the world exists and is being told to me through the flavor text on items or the environmental storytelling that's happening there, there's never one story being told. And even if those worlds are constrained in some way, it's really much more about me as the player finding value in that world as opposed to the world imposing its value on me. And I think that gets closer to something that's akin to a tabletop role-playing game where the world will have a tomorrow after I finish the main story. It just won't involve my specific character. And that's a little bit different than I played my Final Fantasy VII game from the beginning to the ending, and whatever choices I made, in that game specifically, you don't really get to make a lot of choices. It's role playing in name only. Like you're playing as the characters, right?
Rhino,
Exactly, Rhino.
Well, that's, it's funny too, because at the end of Fallout, I can't remember if I think it's the same at the end of Fallout 4. I remember Fallout 3 quite well, but it's like a slideshow, and they're like, oh, there's hundreds of endings, right? And it's like, well, there's hundreds of slideshow endings, right? I mean, it's basically a composite of the missions that you did and the choices that you made, right? So if you sided with one faction or another, then your slideshow had a certain slide and a certain narrative. And just through math, you can be like, oh, well, there were 8 different things, and if you 5 different outcomes for each of those 8, you do the math, and it's like, I guess there's thousands of endings, but it's like, really, there's one. You know what I mean? There's just one. I was going to ask, though, because I think one of the things as we've been talking, I've thought, so we in our sort of immediate group of friends, we played a lot of Valheim, and we've been playing Enshrouded as well, which is another game in which you're collecting resources, building, and whatever. But we will play on Discord with audio chat open, and we relate to each other only in terms of our current personalities. Like, I don't refer to whatever your character is. I don't refer to your character's name playing a digital video game, playing those Enshrouded games, right? I don't say Biff whoever. I say, hey, Steve, why don't you want to come to the swamp area with me? And we talk about all sorts of stuff that, what's going on in the world or whatever in a very different way than if you're sitting around a tabletop, right? And we were playing a tabletop role-playing game. I'd call you your character's name. You know what I mean? And I would be much more in character. So I was wondering, and I've never been part of like a guild in World of Warcraft. MMOs just have never done much for me. But how do you feel, especially if you're playing with strangers, how do you think that works in terms of, and MMOs are not the same kind of, RPGs, role-playing games. But how do you think that works in terms of you've had your character, you've got a history that you've leveled up, and whatever. Is there that same kind of sense if you're playing with different players that you've never met maybe in person? What's the effect there, do you think?
That's a really good question. I've thought about that before because in World of Warcraft specifically, I don't know if this is still the case, but it used to be that there were actually servers that were designated as role play servers. So if you were going to participate on those servers, the expectation was you were going to be your character. So when you spoke when you interact with other people, when you were making decisions about what to do in the world, you're making them as the gnome or the tauren or the elf or whatever you're playing as. And when you talk to other players, you're talking in the parlance of Azeroth. You're not using your real name. You're not talking about current events in the real world, right? But the vast majority of players were on non-role play servers, which meant that everything that they were doing in the game was just transactional. Like to the extent that you were participating with other people who were strangers, and this actually has gotten worse over time. It's one of the reasons why I think that World of Warcraft and other MMOs have become less appealing to me, is because they're not really about those narratives anymore. The narratives are sort of directed at you by, in the case of Warcraft, it's Blizzard. You know, Blizzard storytellers are writing the world of Azeroth as they want to unfold that specific piece of lore. But you as the player are just kind of like along for the ride, and the people that you're playing with, for the most part, and this is not a universal experience, I'm sure there are people who still role play, but for the most part, I think people see this as, well, I've got 20 minutes to kill. I have enough time to run a dungeon. I'm going to go do that, find a group. And all of this is sort of automated now. Whereas previously, when the servers were not all connected to each other, you didn't have cross-faction grouping or cross-guild grouping, cross-server grouping, you actually had to find other people on your server to go run stuff with, which led you to develop these kinds of relationships where you were probably more likely to be in character or at least play a role on your server. That's not the case anymore, where you just hit a button, it queues you up, you find 4 other people, it drops you in, you never say a word to each other, and you just get to the end where I get my loot and I'm done. Like, because then it becomes, it's much more mechanical and mathematical. It's not about...
And transactional. Transactional is a great word.
It's a very, it's sort of a weird byproduct that feels almost capitalist, except the currency you're exchanging is loot. It's just you're doing this thing to help one another get to the most productive outcome. And it's one of the reasons that I picked World of Warcraft up again 8 months ago for a little while, and I played with one of our mutual friends, Phil, and I didn't have existing relationships with anybody in the guild, so I kind of felt on the outside looking in, and they seemed like nice people or whatever. And because of the timing, because they're all on different time zone than I am, I was frequently on when they weren't, and I couldn't stay up late enough most nights to be able to go raid with them. So I often just joined random pickup groups to go do something. And one of the reasons I stopped doing it was because those pickup groups became much more high intensity focused on that transactional nature of the game, where if I screwed up or somebody in the group screwed up, then it becomes a toxic relationship between myself and the other people, and people get mad and they yell at you and swear at you and call you awful things or whatever. And that detracted not just from the social experience of playing this game together, but it also just felt like it killed the narrative of the game. Like, we're running this dungeon for the 5,000th time, and I don't really have anything more to learn about Stratholme or about Blackwing Lair or whatever. I'm doing this because I want the loot, and at the end of the day, if somebody's making that harder for me, then they're just impeding my ability to do the thing that I want to do. Whereas, and this gets back to sort of incentives and goal orientation. Maybe this is a nice circle back to where we started. My goal orientation when I'm playing a game, especially a role-playing game, is to think through what kind of experience do I want to have here as somebody who's helping to co-tell this story. MMOs that become transactional are not really oriented toward that goal of collaborative storytelling anymore. It's much more about, what am I doing to advance my character in some direction that's going to make me more powerful and fulfill my power fantasy? If I'm playing Skyrim, I don't really care so much about that. I care about who are the characters I'm interacting with, what are their opinions, and what are they teaching me about the world. If I'm playing something like Dark Souls, I'm trying to learn the lore of this world and why is it falling apart in the way that it is, and how am I interacting with all of these major characters that I've only ever heard of. And that's just such a categorically different experience for me. And even socially, I think the story that's being told is quite different than other games that I'm playing with friends I know, whether that's Enshrouded and you and I and our friend circle getting together, or what I used to do in high school. My friends would play FPS games together that were sort of split screen on the Nintendo 64. We would make up our own games to go along with them, the characters we'd play as. And one of my favorite examples was we'd play Duke Nukem, and we would each play a character in Duke Nukem. We weren't playing as Duke Nukem, but we would pick houses on the map and say, okay, this is my house, that's your house. I won't go into your house without permission, but if I do, you have permission to kill me. Like, we're crafting our own world house and narrative in the context. Exactly. It's the house rule thing, right? And I think that really gets more at the goal orientation of the players involved. If we all agree that we're playing Enshrouded because it's a way for us to communicate as individuals who have busy lives, that we want to know what's going on with one another, how are you feeling today, what's going on in your personal life, that's a different goal orientation than if we're all sitting around playing Vaesen and our goal orientation is all about the characters we have developed and the
Right.
relationships between them, not us. And so I
Right.
think maybe a good way to think about this is the first person versus third
Third
person kind
person.
of
Yeah.
perspective. I think of our Enshrouded experience as being sort of third person, where we're just
Hmm.
sort of using the characters as a way to project ourselves into this shared space. But when we're playing Vaesen, it's first person. Like I am playing as Astrid, and we are solving this mystery in this
Yep.
part of the world. And
Yep.
when I'm talking to you as the DM, it's or whatever NPC you're portraying as the DM. That's different than all of us sitting in Enshrouded or in Valheim, kind of talking about our individual lived experiences and
Right.
not really focused on the world of Enshrouded as much as the world of our lived reality.
Right, right. No, and that's, I mean, it is interesting as well because I don't know. I mean, part of the reason that I think I'm such a fan of tabletop role-playing games, I mean, unquestionably, if I had to give up one, I would give up digital role-playing games before I gave up tabletop role-playing games. But it makes me wonder whether there's something about the shared imagination, right? That you are
Mm-hmm.
creating these worlds in language and people are making unexpected decisions, and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's a different experience than if we're in Enshrouded, for example, or Valheim. We're all seeing more or less the same thing, maybe from different
Mm-hmm.
perspectives, you know what I mean, whatever. But it's very different than it's like doing an adaptation from a novel. Like, oh, I
Mm-hmm.
didn't picture that character to be like that at all, right? You know, because we all
Mm-hmm.
have our own little version of what these people, look like to us in our own heads. Whereas when you are playing a digital game, then obviously you're all looking at the same ogre. You're all looking in the same. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, you can go wherever you want, but there's no need to be able to narrate it because everybody can just see it, right? And that's where
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's part of that where it's steering more towards a transactional kind of relationship as well. But there's a lot. You can play tennis and decide that you're just going to talk shop between points. You know what I mean? Whatever. So it's not unique necessarily, and I don't think that's a failure of those games. But what you said is exactly correct. Is that you've got different goals of what's going to make that game successful or not. And yeah, role playing games are about, at least for me, they're not about leveling up. They're about emotion. They're about having interesting decisions. They're about failing when you thought you were going to succeed and succeeding when you thought you were going to fail. And digital role playing games, especially if they're on the end of like more of a MMO, they're just not that, right? And it's like I just
Mm-hmm.
don't get personally. I'm so invested in story, so invested in language that I think I personally get more. And no shade to anybody who really enjoys their MMOs because I can understand that too. But yeah, and it's one of those things in which the world doesn't reveal itself in those games the same way nearly as much as a role playing game, a more traditional role playing game. That I was thinking too while you were talking. I think it's Fallout 4 in which they were always going to come across a death claw, which is if you're not familiar, very very deadly enemy, one of the
Mm-hmm.
strongest enemies in the game, where there was a long stretch of railroad track and you couldn't get over the other side of it without running into this death claw. And it was a way of basically them, the designers, I thought quite cleverly, being like, you don't belong over here until you can kill this thing. So you need to
Mm-hmm.
level up until you can kill this thing, and then you can move on, right? And I think I may have sneaked past it once, and then like you just constantly die because it's like there's a reason why they were keeping you over here, right? Or keeping you from getting over here. It's because you're not strong enough yet. And those are the kind of things too in which there's some other sort of incoherencies. Like now when we're playing Enshrouded and one of the characters is up to level 30, and the rest of us are at
Mm-hmm.
5, and it's like, well, that's because you would not really. I wouldn't think you would do that in other types of games either. Have somebody who is so overpowered. Narratively, it doesn't seem to make sense. Like why?
Which
Why
is
is
it's a failure of the medium, I think, because you ultimately end up having to gatekeep. And this is, I think, one of the bigger problems with World of Warcraft and why it became so transactional is because at some point the mechanics of the game limit the affordances that a player can recognize and what they can do in that space, and it has to be constrained because of the designer's goals plus practicality. And that's just a lot different than giving someone complete open-ended control. I mean, it gets back to the gamefulness, playfulness, fun thing again. And
yeah?
actually, to loop this back to education, it's the reason why, as a designer of educational tools, gamification only gets you so
So
far,
far,
whereas
yeah.
being really thoughtful about the sort of inquiry-driven environments that you can create can go a lot longer, or you can get more mileage out of. Because for one thing, the behavioral modification and operant conditioning of assigning points for doing a task isn't going to be a universal reinforcer for everybody. So
Right.
you have to think really carefully about how am I reinforcing certain behaviors. But if you're doing open-ended problem solving, there is no quote unquote right answer. And I think
Right.
that's the thing that matters most in terms of role play, that when somebody is engaged in this world and projecting themselves into it or onto it, they want to inquire about the things they care about. And the
Right.
reinforcement will come from the consequences to those specific inquiries they're making of the environment or however they're learning about the world that they're participating in. So I just find myself in this place of defaulting to the more agency you can give to a player, the better.
Hmm.
And even in games where people do have sort of a shared visualization of what's happening, like Baldur's Gate 3, right? The game is inherently constrained because it's designed by designers. You have to have some visual representation of what's going on. Plus, there's a script and the
Yeah.
characters have to have dialogue or whatever. So there are limits to this. But I still have the ability to create a character and play them the way that I want. And so the inquiry that I'm doing is through the lens of the character I've created. Whereas if I'm playing a game where I'm dropped into being a specific person, there's not really a lot of opportunity for me to exert that agency.
Yeah.
One of the more recent times that I actually started a new game of Baldur's Gate 3, I played as Jimmy McGill, like Saul Goodman, as my main character
Yeah.
with all the other characters in Baldur's Gate 3, and I get to experience the world of Baldur's Gate 3 through the eyes of Jimmy McGill, making
Yeah.
the kinds of decisions that Jimmy McGill might make. And that allows me to exert enough agency that the experience itself isn't quote unquote like getting old in the same way that it would if I
Right.
had to play Baldur's Gate 3 as the same character every time I played it,
Right.
where both of those might be kinds of role play, but one is inherently more limited than the other because I can exert agency in these ways that probably wouldn't be possible if I were just being told by the designer, hey, you're Joel. This is the story of The Last of Us. This is what happens at the end. If you don't like the conclusion, too bad, so sad. We think it's brilliant. And if you don't like it, that's your problem.
Right.
You know, one of those doesn't have to be better than the other, but I do think it's representative of different kinds of ways of letting a world speak through its characters and mechanics and story, as opposed to you know what? It reminds me of the argument I used to have with my high school English teacher who thought there was only one correct way to read The Great Gatsby, and that was F. Scott Fitzgerald's perspective. And it's like, but that's so myopic and stupid. Like, everybody, the whole point of literature or of art is to allow people to experience it in their own ways through their own experience set so that they can come to a unique interpretation based on their life worlds. And if you reduce it to authorial intent is the correct intent, then what was the point of reading the book? Like, why do I care about Gatsby in that case? You know, I have to be able to find the resonance with myself. And, you know, I think that's kind of where I sit on the role play question is, do these digital games allow me to find myself in those specific stories being told, or are they reducing all that complexity as much as possible for technical or authorial reasons that then deprives me of the opportunity to find myself in that place?
Right. And that's right. It does really have to do too with the intentions of the designer, the genre of the game. Like if I'm playing, you know, we played a bunch of Dr. Mario when I was in college too, right? It was a lot of fun, but that's like a totally, you know, there are no characters really, you know what I mean? It's just like a game, right? So it's not that every game needs to be, this is one of the classic things that goes back, I'm thinking about the collection First Person from MIT Press that was a collection of essays on narrative media. And it's like, oh, well, you know, not every game needs to be a story. Not every game, you know, and then it's like, okay, but when you do want to make a story in your game, then it's like, you know, that excuse goes out the window, right? So it's like, yeah, you don't need a story to play, you know, I think it's, I can't remember his name, but you know, so I don't expect you to throw me a ball and expect it to start telling stories, right? Like games are their own thing, but then there are the games with narrative pretensions or narrative goals, and you can have a game like Gone Home or What Remains of Edith Finch, in which
I was just thinking of that.
Those are not role-playing games, right? But they are, you are inhabiting and you are learning about the world, you know, and all those kind of things. So there's sort of a gray area. I wouldn't really call either one of those role-play, especially not What Remains of Edith Finch, a role-playing game. But they're very successful in the way that they tell a certain kind of story. So I think it's one of those things that if I'm looking for a certain kind of experience, and this has happened before too, where it's like, oh, this is a role-playing game or whatever, and I start playing, I'm like, no, it isn't. You know what I mean? It doesn't remind me of that at all. And that's where I think there's some slippery qualities to the genres and the taxonomies of these things as well. But I agree with you that I really enjoy my favorite genre of the digital game is, you know, like being able to find yourself in a new world, get situated in that world, gain some competency, and then figure out what you can do next, right? I mean, where it's less directed and more open world. The more open, the more I like it. And that's right. I know for a lot of people too. Like I remember when I was in graduate school and teaching, being a TA for a class on game culture. That was one of the things in which there was a real divide between people who liked the Bethesda games and then the people who liked who made Mass Effect.
BioWare.
BioWare, right. Maybe we can get that. But yeah, so there's a huge difference between the people who are like, I would say I never really got into the BioWare games because I didn't like being on rails that much. But then there are other people who say they sort of have paralysis when they play Fallout 3 because there's too much that you can do, right? And I'm like, oh, well, I'm definitely on the side of I'm going to go assemble my own story from the available pieces versus I am going to enact a story that has more like, yeah, Mass Effect, yes, there are some choices, the choices that you make that have consequences and there's different playthroughs, but you can't decide, well, today I'm going to go to this moon. You know what I mean? Like you're basically locked into that story on rails, I believe, is the story.
I mean, maybe that's the theme of this episode, is that the role plays range from improv comedy show all the way up to Shakespearean depiction of Hamlet, right?
Yeah,
like you can have the degree of agency that you need to feel fulfilled, and that it's not that you can't find yourself or project yourself in any particular way in either of those. You can play Hamlet or Gertrude or whoever, whatever way you want. But that's still different and more structured than the ill-defined, ill-structured version of there are no rules that are constraining my behavior, and I can kind of just be whoever I want to be in any given moment. And then in both of those cases, what you're doing is using that projection to figure out, how does this world work? What is the space and time that it exists in? And what can I do here? Like, what does it teach me about the world and myself? So, which is
the same questions that we all ask ourselves when the alarm goes off in the morning and we're getting out of bed. What am I doing here? What am I allowed to do? Right? Like, what situation have I found myself in?
Am I going to get 5 stars with the police today?
Yeah, exactly. 5 stars on this podcast today, which 5
stars on this podcast.
I don't know if we deserve 5 stars for this one, but still, I think that's probably a good place to leave it. Gentle listener, you can tell us how many stars we get for this particular role play of Windbags talking about digital role-playing games.
Exert your agency by going to YouTube and liking and subscribing, in addition to giving us a 5-star review on
Smash that follow button. So then I think that, our next step, we wanted to talk about some tabletop games and then compare those to some of the stuff that we just mentioned in digital games. And I've got a whole laundry list of tabletop games that we can talk about. And I'd like to hear about your experiences, but that'll have to wait for another day.
That'll wait for another day. Thanks so much for listening.
Nice talking with you once again, and take care. We'll talk at our listeners again soon.
That's what we're best at.
That's, I guess.
See y'all later.
All right. Bye-bye.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.